the 8th century, in the depths of the Jordanian desert, a caliph of Umayyad, ruler of the emerging Islamic Empire, built a vast palace for his sons. Mashhad was intended as a solitary place where boisterous young princes should live in abstinence, learning to become future rulers. It was once spectacular. But with an Islamic empire that came to surround the Mediterranean, with its center no longer in Damascus, the palace fell into ruins. For the next 500 years, the rulers were Ottomans, based in Turkey. In what is now Jordan, 1,000 years after being built, the palace was threatened by railways and station buildings that wouldn't look out of place in Brandenburg or Berlin. And that's the clue, because this is a story of how Europeans rediscovered the power and grandeur of Islamic art. A story of accident and design, and of powerful egos in an age when personal inclinations had the power to change destinies. In the 1900s, German engineers laid the Hijaz Railway between Istanbul and the holy cities of Medina and Mecca. It passed within 4 kilometers of the Mashhad Palace. In a desert of nothing but shifting sands, its splendid ruins were seen as nothing but ballast for railway lines. There were ruins throughout the Ottoman Empire then. It included Greece and Egypt, cradles of the world's cultures, so there was nothing that was seen as so special in the deserts of Jordan. But some people noticed more than a pile of stones, and the amazing carving on the Mashhad facade became destined to stand somewhere else, protected from the ravages of time and insensitive recycling. At the time, it became more like a rush to be the first in the January sales. With treasure literally lying around, the imperial powers wanted to out-dominate each other in the collecting of ancient art. The English and the French were busily taking mummies and trophies from Egypt for display in the British Museum and the Louvre. The Germans ransacked the Islamic cultural heritage of Mesopotamia, Syria and Turkey to fill new museums in Berlin. Newly integrated Germany was rapidly establishing itself as a world power. Today, Berlin is again establishing itself as the capital and revitalizing its great museums. On Museum Island, the Bode and Pergamon museums draw increasing numbers to marvel at the reconstructed Babylonian mosaics that form Procession Street. Beyond is the huge Ishtar Gate, once entrance to the city of Babylonia itself. The Market Gate of Maltus, on the top floor of the Museum of Islamic Art, beckons visitors towards the giant facade of that palace beside the railway, Mashhad. Almost 100 years ago, it was brought here to the world's first Islamic museum to be studied and understood. Made of sandstone, the facade is over 33 meters long and 5 meters high. 1,000 years haven't destroyed the power of carving so delicate that it looks like a cloth woven on a vast scale. Its interwoven animals, flowers and vegetation seem to suggest an oasis, but interpretation is always in the eyes of the beholder. It's thought that the facade in Berlin formed only part of the palace, and that it may never have been completed. In the desert, time and builders had removed large sections of the palace, and by the turn of the century, some people were getting apprehensive. One man in particular wanted to save the palace before it was too late. His name was Professor Wilhelm von Bode. Of course, he wanted to fill large and brand new German museums, but he was also a humanist. Ever since the French Revolution, intellectuals have become more and more aware of the importance of other races, of other cultures. There may have been increasing domination of other countries, but amongst the artistic elites of Europe, Islamic art was being seen as equal to the world's finest. No longer ethnological curiosities, the works of Islam began to be collected and studied, not as local folklore, but as cultural assets of the entire world. Wilhelm von Bode was part of this tradition, perhaps its greatest propagandist, and he devoted his life to creating one of the greatest of all Islamic art collections. 150 years after his birth, leading figures celebrated his achievement, led by the German president, Roman Herzog.
This morning, we are here to commemorate a man whom the Daily Telegraph described on his death as the greatest museum director. During his own lifetime, he was recognized as one of the greatest, both here and abroad. He had become a legend, and he was surrounded by a whole series of other metaphors. For example, it was said he was the king of German art science and the German Napoleon of art. Whatever the case, we can be sure that we are dealing with an extraordinary figure in remembering Wilhelm von Bode. The magician of Museum Island, to use a contemporary moniker, left us an inheritance which has not diminished in its glamour to this very day.
By the turn of the century, Bode was famous as the director of the Berlin art museums. He was the driving force behind attempts to make them a rival to the world's greatest art collections. And he had realized that art existed outside of Europe. He developed a passion for collecting Persian carpets and realized Islam wasn't some paganistic culture to be civilized, but a civilization in its own right, and a pretty special one at that. Bode was collecting individual artifacts, but his greatest triumph was yet to happen. Retracing Bode's footsteps and managing his legacy is one of his successors, Dr. Volkemar Enderlein.
Die Geschichte beginnt 1897-98.
The story begins in 1897-98. Two German intellectuals were on an archaeological trip through the Near East, that is to say Palestine and the neighboring regions. And what they did was record monuments in this steppe region, ancient monuments. They were Rudolf Ernst Bruno and Alfred von Domaszewski, and their work was published under the title De Provincia Arabia, which appeared in Strasbourg in 1905. So you see, it took 8 years for the publication to be completed. And in the meantime, a great deal happened. For this Bruno approached the professor for the history of art in Graz, one Joseph von Stregowski. And this Joseph von Stregowski got photos of Shatter from Bruno, as they're published here in this book, so as to write a contribution to the work from the perspective of the history of art. But Stregowski did not write this work, this contribution to the work. Instead, he took the photos to Bode in Berlin, i.e. from Vienna to Graz and on to Berlin. He showed Bode these photos and explained to him that the facade, the palace, was endangered by the construction of the Hejaz Railway. This was in February 1902, or so I assume, and Stregowski suggested taking plaster casts of the facade so that at least the art form itself would remain.
Damit sie wenigstens erhalten bleibt in ihrem künstlerischen Ausdruck.
Bode had grander ideas. He took the Strykovsky photographs along the banks of the river Spree to the palace of the emperor, Wilhelm II. The Kaiser appreciated art, but he could also see how bringing the Meschata Palace to Berlin cemented German domination of a crumbling Ottoman Empire. He was determined to have it and wrote to Abdul Hamid, the Sultan, certain that it would be made a gift.
Und daraufhin
Bode pushed forward the whole acquisition of Shatta. It was he who held the reins and cultivated contacts with the Foreign Office and the embassy in Constantinople. After having spoken to Strykovsky, he wrote to Gottlieb Schumacher in Haifa and said, "We have a job here of carrying out some technical work." Schumacher was a top engineer and could handle the technical side. Are you prepared to do it? And Schumacher agreed. Bode also began another aspect of the enterprise. You see, people in those days were thrifty, and so he wrote to Baalbek. Archaeologists were at work in Baalbek, investigating the temple area there. Bode wrote, "Take a look at Shatta. What does it look like? What is it?" And on Bode's instructions, that is those of the Berlin museums, they rode off to Shatta, a fair way on horseback, and took pictures of Shatta.
The researchers made detailed drawings of what the palace may have looked like. They served to reinforce the Kaiser's determination. The Sultan was heavily in debt to Germany and wasn't about to refuse. He also knew that Germany and the Kaiser offered the best chance of his own political survival. Germany was in the ascendancy as a world power, and while Russia, England and France plotted to break up the Ottoman Empire and divide the spoils, Kaiser Wilhelm wanted it intact and as a firm ally. He was pouring military aid into the country and was constantly making official visits to Constantinople, tirelessly greeting Ottoman aristocracy and generals. He was entertained by the Mehta military band, then, as now, a symbol of a bygone age of conquest. It was all too late, but before the First World War, there was an unquestioning belief in national power. Today, Constantinople is Istanbul, still mysterious and yet part of Europe. A clash of cultures that still need understanding. In 1903, it was simpler. The rulers ruled. Here at the Yildiz Palace, the Sultan duly promised, in writing, to give the Meschata facade to the Emperor of Germany. There were no questions of Islamic heritage or the rights of the people. The Sultan and the Emperor did as they pleased. Kaiser Wilhelm had this large fountain built in the center of Istanbul as a personal gift for the Sultan. Expensively decorated on the ceiling with their personal emblems, symbolically celebrating their relationship and interdependence.
Es ist also zu beachten, dass öffentliche Mittel, staatliche Mittel für diese
It must be noted that no public state means were available for this acquisition, but that it was privately financed. And Bode used this sum to finance Schumacher. Over many months, Gottlieb Schumacher hired stonemasons, had the packaging material prepared, procured canisters for the drinking water, and prepared the whole technical side. When the workers arrived in Shatta, they had a great deal to do. he did not simply have the blocks making up the facade dismantled, but in order to save on transport costs, he had the top layers removed from the blocks. That is, he had the stonemasons peel off the layers, such that the blocks you see today in the museum are not of the original thickness, but are only 20 to 25 centimeters thick. And this work, the peeling of the blocks, the packaging, all took place in just under 6 weeks. Once everything was packed in crates, they were carried by Turkish soldiers and by the workers to the nearest station, which still stands today. They were transferred to a French railway line across Lebanon, northwards, where they were brought to a German steamer belonging to the Hapag line, destined for Hamburg. From Hamburg, they continued by barge, just like the ones used today. And finally, on Christmas Eve 1903, the barge moored here at the museum.
1903 langte der Kahn hier am Museum an.
Safely in Berlin, the Mushatta facade was admired until 40 years later, the museum was bombed during the Second World War. Everything was reduced to rubble. It was painstakingly restored in Soviet times and has since been represented in new surroundings.
Today, Shutter presents us with a whole series of questions. Questions which we cannot answer with any degree of certainty. For example, if we look straight up in the first triangle of the facade, we can make out a human face, looking out of the facade into the distance. And there are parallels which we can explain or use. We know of the representation of the Caliph from the palace of Khibat al-Mafja at Jericho. You can see the Caliph and the head of the accompanying figure in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. So we know from Khibat al-Mafja that the Caliph had himself portrayed. But whether the figure here, in the very top of this triangle, above a lion, you will notice, is meant to be the Caliph, we cannot tell. But at least we can assume so.
Today, Mushatta is surrounded by Amman's airport and industrial estates. Industrialization and modernization are creeping up on 1,000 years of history quicker than any other change in the desert. Access has never been easier, and with it, the threat of theft. It's thought that the Mushatta Palace was never actually completed, and its ruins in Jordan are still beside the Hijaz Railway. The railway no longer takes the faithful for 1,500 kilometers deep into the desert towards Mecca, but it does take tourists on short trips. The engines are original, and the uniforms try to recreate a different age. Maybe the engine driver remembers. It's still possible to travel the narrow-gauge line through the suburbs of Amman and imagine the presence of Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence blew up the Hijaz Railway during the First World War as part of the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Few mourned its passing, but what tourists do appreciate is the romance of Bedouin hordes taking control. Today, Jordanians play on European notions of the uncivilized Arab. but hopefully they know better. Who can resist the romance of danger, adventures in the sands, just as long as the hotel isn't too far away?
Everybody get down! Hey! Everybody, hey! Everybody get down!
There may not yet be freedom here, but the theft of Islamic art on the scale of the Kaisers is no longer conceivable. The ruins of Mushtata remain valuable, though, and thieves still saw off ornamentation to be smuggled to greedy buyers in Switzerland. There is a real problem of security. Can Mushtata be preserved and protected in the Jordanian desert? We asked Dr. Ghazi Bishar, Director General of the Jordanian Administration of Ancient Art, whether Mushtata should have gone to Berlin.
At that time, in fact, when there was no strong central authority to enforce the law, and the palace itself was used as a quarry for building stones, in that sense, maybe I would look at it in a way that it was perhaps a legitimate step to do. That's to transport this facade to protect it, to study it, and in fact a lot of studies, publications came out since then, since the transportation of this facade to Berlin. And I've seen it in Berlin itself. It displayed in one huge room, a beautiful display. It's quite attractive. And the second point, there are maybe many more people visit the Bérgamon Museum, and they have the chance to see some of our culture, or one aspect of our rich cultural heritage. Okay, in terms of protection measures, we took some, I would say, makeshift steps, like fencing around the Qasr itself, the wire fence, and then appointing a guard. In fact, there are 2 guards who are supposed to be here all the time. And this, in my opinion, is not enough. The most important thing is to educate the people and make them aware of the importance of this building.
At least in a museum, marvels of human endeavour can be safely appreciated, and arguably their installation, far from where they came from, is justified. Or certainly was in less stable times. But now, thousands of art treasures removed from their original countries stand trial. Was their taking a reflection of imperial arrogance? Was it to protect them from uncivilized foreigners who don't appreciate their own heritage? Or is it a fait accompli? Some governments have demanded the return of their treasures, but who will pay? Could as many people see them? Who do they really belong to? Academics are themselves divided. Professor Ikmeluddin is Director General of the Research Center for Islamic History, Art and Culture in Istanbul.
It's fair to think that these monuments, to start with, categorically we have to say this is a human asset. This is a human property. It belongs to the whole human civilization. Either it is Eastern, Western, Near Eastern, or Far Eastern, it belongs to the humankind, and this is human property. It belongs to all of us, because this is a common history, this is a common civilization. Secondly, the circumstances which allowed to this, that these monuments move from their homeland to other part of the world should be considered. And thirdly, I would say that it is like having adopted son. And if the parents would like to have their son back, I think it's very humane to allow them to go home and to allow them to be with their own parents.
If the Mushtə facade was a gift from the Sultan ruling conquered lands, then was its installation in Berlin legal? We asked the president of the Foundation of the Prussian Cultural Collection, Professor Knopp.
The acquisition of the Mushtə facade was legal. It was not stolen. Rather, the ruler at that time transferred it to the German emperor by way of an international treaty. And so this argument holds. It's on show to everybody as part of the world's cultural heritage. It's different again with the works which were stolen, which were taken illegally. For there's enough of a legal man in me to say that the right of possession here has to be agreed.
Professor Bode, let alone his benefactor, the Kaiser of Germany, would probably be horrified that such a debate is going on. But then that is perhaps the real meaning of a humanistic struggle for understanding.